telephone in the rear of the cabin, Mucklow acted as an intermediary between Cooper and the rest of the flight crew for the remainder of the hijacking. For the next hour and a half, Flight 305 maintained a holding pattern near Seattle, while local and federal authorities scrambled to procure the ransom as well as the 4 parachutes. 10,000 $20 bills were collected from a local bank, while the owner of a nearby skydiving school supplied the chutes. At 5:45 p.m., more than 2 hours past its scheduled arrival, Flight 305 finally touched down in Seattle. By this point, it was well after sunset, and the aircraft was brought to a remote section of the tarmac. Once the flight came to a stop, both the ransom and the parachutes were handed over to Mucklow, who then brought them back aboard. In exchange, Cooper permitted 2 of the flight attendants as well as all the passengers to disembark, many of whom had not yet realized the flight had been hijacked. With the ransom paid and only 4 crew members remaining on board, Cooper told Mucklow to inform the captain that he wanted to fly to Mexico City. They were to fly with the landing gear down, the flaps at 15 degrees and below 10,000 feet. The lights in the cabin were to be switched off, and the aft stairway, which opens from the underbelly of the fuselage, was to remain extended. 2 of Cooper's demands could not be satisfied. First of all, the flight configuration he'd requested would not allow for a non-stop flight to Mexico City. As such, Cooper proposed a refueling stop in Phoenix, Yuma, or Sacramento before they all agreed on Reno, Nevada. Second of all, it was not possible to depart with the ventral staircase extended. Cooper agreed to retract the stairs on the condition that Mucklow remained by his side and taught him how to extend them once the plane was airborne. Parked for nearly 2 hours due to complications with refueling, Flight 305 was back in the air by 7:36 p.m. Less than 5 minutes after takeoff, Cooper told Mucklow to head for the cockpit and that from this point onwards, he was not to be disturbed. The last time she saw Cooper, he was standing in the middle of the aisle as if though he was preparing to jump. Mucklow joined the rest of the crew, locked the cockpit door behind her, and some 3 hours later, Flight 305 safely landed in Reno. Once the flight came to a stop, the crew carefully ventured into the rear of the cabin, but there was no sign of Cooper nor the bomb. The aft stairway had been extended mid-flight and was slightly damaged upon landing. It seemed there was only one explanation for the hijacker's absence. At some point between Seattle and Reno, Cooper had strapped on a parachute, walked down the stairs, and leaped into the dark of night. As soon as it became clear that Cooper was no longer on board, dozens of FBI agents converged upon the aircraft only to discover a disappointing amount of physical evidence. A black clip-on tie, 8 cigarette butts, and 2 of the 4 parachutes were all that Cooper left behind. Evidently, he'd brought the ransom and briefcase along with him. In interviews conducted on the night of the hijacking, Cooper was described by the crew and passengers as a white male with brown eyes and dark hair. He appeared to be in his mid-40s and wore a dark trench coat, a dark suit, a white shirt, a black tie, and dark shoes. Soon after boarding, he'd also donned a pair of sunglasses. Based on this description, the FBI produced the first of several composite sketches. Before they could mount a search, however, the FBI had to figure out when Cooper abandoned ship. But that was easier said than done. None of the 4 crew members witnessed Cooper jumping from the plane, nor did the pilots of 2 fighter jets which escorted the flight between Seattle and Reno, which is not all too surprising given it was the middle of the night. Although the flight crew did report something odd, the last communication with the hijacker occurred at approximately 8:05 p.m. when the crew used the intercom to offer assistance, which Cooper declined. Within the next 10 minutes, the crew experienced what they described as an oscillation or vibration of the aircraft. At the time, the crew suspected it might have been produced by Cooper's jump, and a subsequent recreation of the hijacking supported that conclusion. Okay, so that took care of the when, but what about the where? While Cooper was very explicit about the flight's configuration and destination, he never specified any kind of route. In fact, Cooper grew so impatient with the slow refueling in Seattle that he dismissed the captain's request to file a flight plan and simply told him to, quote, get the show on the road. As such, the captain chose to fly along an airway known as Victor 23 without any input from Cooper. By using Victor 23 as a guide, authorities estimated the most probable location of the flight at the approximated time of the jump was about 40 kilometers north of Portland. And so, at the break of dawn, the FBI mounted an impressive search operation using helicopters, airplanes, and ground troops. The problem was, even if the estimated bailout point was accurate, Cooper's eventual landing or drop zone was far more difficult to pinpoint. The loosely defined search area covered a vast stretch of mountainous wilderness occluded by a dense forest, so it was truly like finding a needle in a haystack. Apart from the difficult terrain, the search was further complicated by low temperatures and inclement weather, which persisted for days. Despite their best efforts, authorities never managed to find a single trace of Cooper, nor the items he'd brought along with him. Having made little to no progress by early December, the FBI turned their attention to the $200,000 ransom. The money had been collected from the Seattle First National Bank, which maintained a ransom package of $250,000 just for such an occasion. Because of this, the serial numbers of the $10,020 banknotes given to Cooper had been documented in advance, a complete list of which were quickly made available to financial institutions, government agencies, and the general public. The intention was to make it as difficult as possible for Cooper to spend his money. Northwest Airlines and several newspapers even began to offer rewards to anyone who could find a note with a matching serial number. In spite of these efforts, no one ever did. That is until nearly a decade later. In early 1980, a young boy named Brian Ingram was building a campfire on a small beach in southern Washington. As he was digging into the sand, Ingram discovered 3 bundles of cash totaling $5,880. Having heard about the infamous skyjacking, Ingram's parents brought the severely degraded bundles to the FBI. The notes were promptly inspected, and sure enough, the serial numbers matched those of the ransom. Once the excitement subsided, however, the money managed to raise far more questions than it answered, the most significant of which was how? How did the money end up so far away from the drop zone? Looking at this map, it might be tempting to think that Cooper simply dropped some of the money, which then fell into the Lewis River. The bundles could then have been carried further downstream by the Columbia River before finally being washed ashore at Tina Bar, which is the name of the beach. Tina Mucklow, Tina Bar. Coincidence? Yeah, coincidence. Anyway, the problem with this idea is that the Columbia River flows in the opposite direction. This has led some, including members of the FBI, to re-evaluate the initial drop zone assessment. For instance, if the drop zone was much further southeast, close to a river called the Washougal River, it is conceivable, albeit improbable, that the money floated all the way down to Tina Bar. Alternatively, the bundles may have simply landed on the beach if the flight path was further to the west. Even so, natural explanations struggle to explain how 3 independent, potentially free-falling and/or free-floating bundles of cash ended up at the exact same place on the same beach. To complicate matters, sediment from the riverbed was excavated and dumped onto Tina Bar as part of a dredging operation in 1974. And according to one analysis, the money was discovered above this layer of sediment. If true, that would mean the money came to rest at Tina Bar sometime after 1974. But a re-examination of that analysis found that what was believed to be a layer of deposited sediment might actually have been a perfectly natural layer of clay. Not only that, but the sediment was clearly dumped some distance away from where the money was discovered. Furthermore, when Ingram discovered the bundles, the rubber bands which held them together were still intact. This is significant because experiments conducted in 2009 revealed that this brand of rubber bands could not withstand exposure to open air or water for more than a year. So, unless the bundles were somehow protected from the elements, they must have become buried at Tina Bar within a year of the hijacking. The most probable explanation, therefore, seems to be that Cooper or someone else deliberately buried the money. Did Cooper survive and bury the money himself? Did someone else bury the money after stumbling upon Cooper's remains? If there is an explanation which does not require human intervention, it's managed to elude investigators for decades. Suffice it to say, this is a mystery within a mystery. Since Ingram's discovery in 1980, both Tina Bar and the grounds around the Washougal River have been subjected to numerous searches, but to date, there's been no sign of Cooper nor the rest of the money. From the very beginning, it was assumed by many that Cooper did not survive his daring escape. It would not make for a very thrilling conclusion to this story, but that's the thing about stories, they're usually far more exciting than reality. While there is no hard evidence for nor against Cooper's survival, the assumption that he fell to his death is not without merit. When Cooper leaped into the darkness, Flight 305 was plowing through a frigid rainstorm at roughly 170 knots, 10,000 feet above southern Washington. The wind was so violent that it ripped out a placard from the aft stairway, which was later recovered in 1978 almost directly below the estimated flight path. To say that Cooper was not dressed for the occasion would be an understatement. The ground beneath him, meanwhile, was obscured by multiple layers of clouds, which likely means that Cooper jumped without knowing his precise location. Even if he could see the ground and had a specific drop zone in mind, the parachute he selected was non-steerable, meaning he would not have been able to steer his descent towards a specific landing spot, thus precluding any potential coordination with an accomplice stationed on the ground. While Cooper expressed some familiarity with parachutes, his actual competence level is up for debate. It's widely believed that Cooper demanded 2 pairs of parachutes, 2 primary and 2 reserve, to make the authorities believe that he intended to take a hostage. That is precisely what happened, as the FBI contemplated but eventually decided against sabotaging the chutes, as they did not want to risk the life of an innocent civilian. But in their haste to obtain them, they unintentionally provided Cooper with a non-functional dummy chute intended for training purposes. This mishap seems to have gone unnoticed by Cooper because that dummy chute was one of the 2 missing from the plane. Not only that, but Cooper chose the older and technically inferior parachute out of the 2 primary chutes provided. So in both cases, it seems like Cooper made the worst possible choice. But there are other ways to interpret this information. For instance, it's possible that Cooper used the dummy chute not as a reserve but as a means to secure the bag of money. In fact, that is precisely what Cooper tried to do with the functional reserve chute. First, he tried to place the money in the chute's canopy before removing some of the suspension lines and wrap them around the bag. Perhaps he used the dummy chute for a similar purpose. And Cooper's decision to use the older primary chute is not necessarily an indication of inexperience. It could also be a sign of familiarity, because the chute he left behind was a civilian luxury chute, while the one he used was a military chute. The argument is that Cooper might have been trained as, say, a paratrooper, and chose the older military chute because that's the one with which he was most familiar. And there is at least one other reason to suspect that Cooper had a military background. While the flight was in a holding pattern near Seattle, Cooper mentioned that the McCord Air Force Base was only 20 minutes away from the Seattle-Tacoma airport. At the time, that was an accurate assessment and might suggest a military background. Apart from the potential military connections, Cooper may even have had links to the Central Intelligence Agency. You see, the type of aircraft which Cooper chose to hijack, a Boeing 727, was also used by the CIA to covertly drop agents and supplies during the Vietnam War. A task for which the Boeing 727 was uniquely qualified due to its distinctive aft stairway. So it's fairly safe to assume that Cooper chose to hijack a Boeing 727 specifically because it provided a relatively safe means of escape. Whether he learned of this from the CIA or came to that conclusion independently is another question. However, the fact that Cooper chose to hijack a flight operated by Northwest Airlines was apparently random chance. When Tina Mucklow asked Cooper about his motives, he responded, "It's not because I have a grudge towards your airline, it's just because I have a grudge." He further clarified that Flight 305 just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Even so, it's clear that Cooper came prepared. He seemed to know a great deal about aircraft and aviation, he appeared to be familiar with the local terrain, he maintained a low profile to avoid a panic, he covered his eyes with a pair of glasses to conceal his identity, he left very little evidence behind, and he demanded 4 parachutes to force the assumption that he was taking a hostage. He was even cunning enough to reclaim the note which he'd initially given to Florence Schaffner. Apart from the name he wrote on his plane ticket, there are no other samples of Cooper's handwriting. But for all his planning and cunning, it seems Cooper did not give enough thought to his eventual escape. Not only did he fail to specify a route, but he was forced to make a last-minute destination change from Mexico City to Reno. He could have demanded more appropriate parachuting equipment like a pair of boots, a helmet, or jumpsuit. He could even have specified the ransom to be delivered in larger denominations to make it lighter and less cumbersome to carry. Presuming he did survive the fall and made it safely to the ground, he may then have had to make his way through a dense, partially snow-covered forest in nothing but loafers and a trench coat in late November. I get the distinct impression that Cooper's escape was much more of a leap of faith than a carefully executed jump. On the other hand, authorities never received a missing persons report matching the description of Cooper in the wake of the hijacking. This might suggest that Cooper did survive and that he swiftly and quietly resumed his normal routine. Furthermore, other hijackers have performed similar stunts, and many of them did survive even if they were quickly apprehended. Finally, the simplest explanation for how 3 bundles of cash ended up at Tina Bar is human intervention. At the end of the day, most of this is based on nothing but supposition. Without any concrete evidence of Cooper's demise, it leaves the door wide open to the far more exciting proposition that he did, in fact, survive. By the time the press got wind of the hijacking, the FBI had already begun to investigate a few potential suspects. Among them was a man in Portland with initials DB and surname Cooper. This Cooper was quickly eliminated as a suspect, but due to a mix-up by the press, the name Dan Cooper was confused for DB Cooper, and the rest is history. While Dan Cooper is most likely a pseudonym, there is a comic book series of the same name. The comic is written in French and centers around a Canadian pilot named Dan Cooper. While the comic was not translated into English nor sold in the United States before 1971, it was available in Canada, which has a large French-speaking population. Given that American and Canadian accents can be difficult to distinguish, it's possible that Cooper, who was described as having no discernible accent, was a bilingual Canadian. This might even be supported by something that Cooper might have said. You see, when the captain relayed Cooper's demands to air traffic control, he used the phrase negotiable American currency. It seems doubtful that an American citizen would specify American currency, so perhaps Cooper was not American. The problem is, we don't know if this is a direct quote from Cooper or paraphrasing by the captain. For instance, notes taken by the crew during the hijacking merely contain the phrase negotiable currency, while testimonies provided by the crew after the hijacking include phrases like $200,000 in cash and circulated US currency. So Cooper might have been Canadian, and he might have taken his name from the Dan Cooper comics, just as he might have been American and might have taken his name from something or someone else. Nearly half a century has gone by since the hijacking took place, and in that time thousands of suspects have been questioned and investigated. It would obviously be impossible to cover all of them here, but let's take a look at some of the people that at some point or another have been suspected of being DB Cooper. Robert Rackstraw first became a suspect in 1978, and on the surface he seems like a solid candidate. He was a decorated Army paratrooper and helicopter pilot. He had experience with explosives. He had an extensive criminal record. He had an uncle named John Cooper who was an avid skydiver. He was expelled from the army only months before the hijacking, which might suggest a motive. After all, the hijacker did say he had a grudge. When confronted by journalists and private investigators, Rackstraw would neither confirm nor outright deny that he was DB Cooper. Instead, he'd say things like, "I could have been," or "I would not discount myself." On the other hand, Rackstraw had light-colored eyes, which Cooper did not. More significantly, Rackstraw was only 28 years of age at the time of the hijacking. This is well outside the range of ages reported by the crew and passengers, most of whom believed Cooper was in his mid-40s. Kenneth Christensen first became a suspect in 2003 when his brother noticed certain parallels between him and Cooper. Christensen had briefly served as a paratrooper in World War II and since 1953 he'd worked for Northwest Airlines as both a mechanic and a flight attendant. He was 45 years old at the time of the hijacking. He was left-handed, which Cooper might have been. For instance, Cooper used his left hand to interact with his briefcase, and the clip-on tie he left on board was affixed with a tie clasp applied from the left. Shortly before he died in 1994, Christensen had supposedly told his brother, "There is something you should know, but I cannot tell you." After his passing, his family discovered over $200,000 in his bank accounts. To top it all off, Florence Schaffner stated that photographs of Christensen bore a strong resemblance to Cooper. On the other hand, Christensen did not match the physical description of Cooper. He was both shorter and lighter. While Schaffner did see a strong resemblance, she remarked that Cooper had more hair, and that is supported by the composite sketches. And there was nothing suspicious about the large sums of money which he'd simply earned by selling land. Richard McCoy first became a suspect in 1972 when he hijacked a Boeing 727 and escaped via the aft stairway, much like D.B. Cooper. Because of the significant overlap between the two hijackings, some believe they must have been committed by the same person. McCoy used a fake name, he used a fake hand grenade to threaten the crew, he used handwritten notes to issue his demands. Both McCoy and Cooper used the phrase "no funny stuff" as a warning to the crew. McCoy demanded $500,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. McCoy also bailed out the back of the plane once they passed over his hometown in the state of Utah. Apart from the similar modus operandi, McCoy had also served in the Vietnam War as a demolitions expert and a helicopter pilot. McCoy did actually survive the fall and managed to evade authorities for 2 full days before he was apprehended and sentenced to 45 years in prison. Before his death in 1974, McCoy refused to confirm or deny that he was D.B. Cooper. On the other hand, McCoy was an avid recreational skydiver and even came prepared with a skydiving helmet and jumpsuit. He gave very specific instructions about the flight path. In addition to the fake hand grenade, McCoy also used an unloaded handgun to threaten the crew. He failed to retrieve one of the notes he'd given to a flight attendant. He was only 29 years of age at the time of the hijacking, and all 3 flight attendants were quite certain that McCoy was not Cooper. While there are meaningful parallels between these 2 cases, McCoy might simply have been a copycat who'd read about D.B. Cooper in the news. Dwayne Webber first became a suspect in 1995 when, shortly before his death, he supposedly told his wife, "I've got a secret to tell you. I am Dan Cooper." Following his deathbed confession, Webber's widow recalled a number of fascinating details. She claims to have found a bank bag resembling the one used in the hijacking. She claims Webber had sustained a knee injury after jumping out of a plane. Webber supposedly had a nightmare about leaving his fingerprints on the aft stairs. And a year before the money was discovered at Tina Bar, Webber had allegedly paid a quick visit to the same location. In addition, Webber was a World War II veteran, he had an extensive criminal record, he'd matched the physical description, and he was 47 years old in 1971. On the other hand, Webber's fingerprints did not match any of the prints collected from Flight 305. Although, to be fair, there's no way to know if any of those prints actually belonged to Cooper. Furthermore, Webber's DNA did not match a DNA sample collected from the tie clasp. But once again, there's no way to know if the DNA on the tie clasp actually came from the hijacker and not someone else. What's so frustrating is that the FBI likely had a much better source of DNA at one point. If you recall, 8 cigarette butts were collected from the scene, and there's a good chance they were all suffused with Cooper's DNA. The problem is, that evidence was lost at some point and has not turned up since. William Smith first became a suspect in 2018. Smith served in the Navy during World War II and likely had some experience with parachuting. He was 43 years old at the time of the hijacking. He had dark brown eyes. He matched the physical description. He shared a certain likeness with the composite sketches, especially this speculative sketch of an older D.B. Cooper. A student named Ira Daniel Cooper, who was killed in World War II, attended the same high school as Smith. Smith worked as a yardmaster for a railroad company for most of his life, but in 1970 the company filed for bankruptcy. As a consequence, Smith lost his pension, which might suggest a motive. He could, for instance, have developed a grudge towards the airline industry for their role in bringing about the downfall of the rail transportation industry. It's further speculated that Smith could have used his knowledge of railroad networks to hop on a train and escape undetected. On the other hand, Smith spent his entire life in the northeastern United States. Given that the hijacking occurred on the other side of the country and was committed by someone who at least appeared to be familiar with the local terrain, Smith is not the most ideal candidate. However, the fact that Smith worked as a yardmaster is interesting. You see, the tie that Cooper left behind was recently examined using an electron microscope, which uncovered various metallic particles. Some of these particles, especially pure titanium, were quite rare in 1971. This might suggest that Cooper worked as a manager at some sort of chemical or metallurgical facility, or possibly a rail yard. If nothing else, I hope this limited selection of suspects illustrates just how difficult it is to be certain when you have so little evidence to work with. These 5 individuals look nothing alike, yet any one of them could be D.B. Cooper. Was Cooper really in his mid-40s, or did he simply look old for his age? Did Cooper really serve in the military? Which one of these sketches most closely resemble Cooper? In 2016, the FBI had to admit defeat and officially close down the case. Unless someone stumbles upon Cooper's remains or manages to track down the rest of the money, it seems there is little hope of resolution. Did Cooper survive? I have no idea. But as long as that possibility cannot be dismissed, the legend of D.B. Cooper will no doubt persist.
Just let me know.
Delivery Malaysia 370, good morning.
Malaysia 370, standby.
At Kuala Lumpur International Airport, a Boeing 777 is preparing for departure.
Malaysian 370, request level.
370, we are ready, requesting flight level 350 to Beijing.
Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 is a daily passenger flight between Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia and Beijing, China.
370, 32 right of takeoff. Nice. 32 right, Malaysia, Malaysia 370, thank you, right.
42 minutes past midnight, Flight 370 is given clearance to depart. On board are Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, 10 cabin crew members, and 227 passengers.
Number control, Malaysian 370.
Malaysian 370, Lumpur radar, good morning. Climb flight level 250.
Morning, level 250, Malaysian 370.
Malaysian 370, climb flight level 350.
Level 350, Malaysian 370.
Less than an hour into the flight, the plane is cruising over the South China Sea at an altitude of 35,000 feet. The night sky is clear and the weather is calm. Flight 370 is then instructed to signal air traffic control in Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam, as it is about to enter Vietnamese airspace. The flight controller in Kuala Lumpur says goodnight, with no sign that anything should be amiss.
Malaysian 370, maintaining level 350.
Malaysian 370.
Malaysian 370, maintaining level 350.
Malaysian 370. Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9, good night.
Good night, Malaysian 370.
1 minute and 43 seconds later, the aircraft suddenly vanish from radar screens at Kuala Lumpur Ho Chi Minh, and Bangkok. This form of positional tracking depends on a signal being emitted by one of two transponders aboard a plane, and so its disappearance would suggest both transponders ceased to function, or the system was manually deactivated by someone on board. All subsequent attempts to contact and ascertain the whereabouts of Flight 370 are unsuccessful. The aircraft has seemingly vanished without a trace. After missing its scheduled time of arrival in Beijing some 4 hours later, Flight 370 is officially declared missing. And in the wake of that announcement, the most expensive search effort in aviation history is about to commence. The search was initially concentrated around the location of the flight's disappearance between the South China Sea and the Gulf of Thailand. The search area was soon expanded, however, after the Malaysian military disclosed additional information. Unlike the radar system employed by air traffic control, long-range military radar does not rely on transponders but use reflectance to track the position of aerial targets. A review of the data collected by the Malaysian military revealed that moments after contact with Flight 370 was lost, the aircraft had deviated from its scheduled flight path with a subtle turn to the right, followed by a prolonged turn to the left. The aircraft had then flown back towards and across the Malaysian peninsula before turning right near the island of Penang. It maintained this northwesterly heading until it escaped the radar's coverage. Over the next few days, the Strait of Malacca, the Andaman Sea, and the Bay of Bengal was scoured by a multinational fleet of aircraft and vessels, but there was no trace of Flight 370. Meanwhile, investigators began to analyze the aircraft's satellite communication records. Like all modern airliners, Flight 370 was equipped with a satellite communications terminal, or SATCOM, to send and receive transmissions to and from the ground. Prior to departure, the SATCOM terminal had logged onto the satellite network and established a connection with a ground station in Perth, Australia. That station then maintained a detailed record of all the incoming and outgoing traffic between it and Flight 370. This is what it contained. Prior to the flight's disappearance over the South China Sea, everything appeared to be working as intended. Then, at some point during this portion of the flight, the SATCOM link was severed. For whatever reason, the terminal ceased to respond. But 3 minutes after the flight vanished over the Andaman Sea, the terminal requested to log back onto the network. The SATCOM link was successfully re-established and was not disrupted again until nearly 6 hours later, when the flight is presumed to have crashed due to fuel exhaustion. During these final hours, 2 attempts were made to contact the plane via satellite telephone. Both calls were acknowledged by the SATCOM terminal and would have been routed to the cockpit. Yet, they went unanswered. The terminal had also responded to 5 automatic status requests. In short, if the ground station had not heard from the aircraft in over an hour, it would transmit a signal to confirm the terminal was still online. While these transmissions did not contain any information about the flight's position, investigators were able to measure the distance between the satellite and the aircraft at the time of each transmission, based on how long it took those transmissions to be sent and received. This generated 7 rings of possible locations from which 7 of these transmissions are thought to have originated. By taking fuel consumption, speed, and other factors into account, flight path analysis indicated the most probable origin of the final transmission to be somewhere along this arc in the southern Indian Ocean. The search effort shifted accordingly, and as the region fell within the jurisdiction of Australia, the Australian government took charge of the operation. Over the next few weeks, the search area was progressively refined to account for oceanic drift as well as improved estimations of the flight path. But this part of the southern Indian Ocean is so remote it took 6 days just to get there. A new fleet of aircraft and vessels gradually covered more than 4.5 million square kilometers of ocean, but Flight 370 was nowhere to be found. If the impact with the ocean had been sufficiently forceful, it was possible the resulting sound had been recorded by underwater listening devices known as hydrophones. This possibility was investigated, and 4 hydroacoustic monitoring stations had recorded something. While the timing and direction of the sound were reasonably consistent with the final satellite transmission, the estimated origin was not. The sound was in all likelihood caused by nothing more than geological activity. Flight 370 was also equipped with 2 underwater locator beacons which had a battery life of some 40 days, and as the deadline approached in early April, signals with a pulse and frequency somewhat similar to the signal emitted by the beacons were detected at depths of up to 3,000 meters. An autonomous submersible then spent weeks scanning the seafloor where the signals had been detected, but no wreckage was ever found. And nothing would be found until more than 16 months later, when a discovery was made on the opposite side of the Indian Ocean. On the 29th of July 2015, a group of people were cleaning up a beach in Reunion, a small island to the east of Madagascar, when they stumbled upon this 2-meter-long metallic object covered in barnacles. Aviation experts quickly identified the object as a section of an aircraft wing known as a flaperon. Upon closer inspection, internal markings including dates and serial numbers conclusively ascertained the flaperon belonged to Flight 370. Even though Reunion Island is some 4,000 kilometers west of the search area, and more than a year had gone by since the flight disappeared, the location was consistent with simulations of debris dispersal patterns. There was now tangible evidence that Flight 370 had crashed somewhere in the Indian Ocean. The discovery of the flaperon prompted numerous searches along beaches and shorelines of southeastern Africa, and at least 31 additional items of interest have since been recovered and examined. Some of these items include a section of the outboard flap from the right wing, a piece of cowling from one of the 2 engines, a partial door from the nose landing gear, a section of the vertical stabilizer, and a mangled casing from one of the embedded headrest monitors. 18 of these items were identified as either likely, highly likely, or almost certain to have originated from Flight 370, whereas only 3 could be confirmed. The remaining 11 could not be identified. There were no traces of an explosion found on any of the debris tested, nor was there any evidence of a fire except for 3 small burn marks on one of the unidentifiable items. The search for debris was further aided by Earth observation satellites. Analyses of satellite imagery from March of 2014 uncovered a number of images which appeared to feature man-made objects floating on or just below the surface in the southern Indian Ocean. However, the images were not nearly sharp enough to resolve any identifiable markings, and multiple searches notwithstanding, this debris was never recovered. A satellite image taken mere hours after the final transmission also captured what appeared to be a contrail some distance away from the search area. A later analysis, however, concluded it was most likely a shadow from a somewhat linear cloud formation. The underwater portion of the search continued for months and eventually years before it was finally suspended in early 2017, by which point some 120,000 square kilometers of seabed had been scrutinized. The search effort was then resumed by an American salvage company known as Ocean Infinity, but after more than a year of searching, they too came up empty-handed. Unless the final resting place of Flight 370 can be located, it may be impossible to determine exactly why it crashed. Nevertheless, there have been no shortage of theories. On the day of the disappearance, 2 of the passengers raised suspicion as they had boarded the flight with stolen passports, which immediately prompted concerns of a hijacking. But investigators were unable to link the 2 men to any terrorist organizations, and soon determined they had traveled under false identities because they were seeking asylum, not due to any nefarious intent. Similar suspicions were raised when one of the passengers were identified as a flight engineer, who might have possessed the necessary expertise to take control of a Boeing 777. Apart from the 239 persons on board, Flight 370 carried nearly 11 metric tons of cargo. Among the items listed on the flight manifest was a shipment of lithium-ion batteries, which led some to suspect a fire might have broken out mid-flight. For instance, the crash of UPS Airlines Flight 6 in September of 2010 was the result of a fire that was ignited by a pallet of lithium-ion batteries. Another potential source of ignition would be an electrical malfunction. The crash of Swiss Air Flight 111 in September of 1998 is thought to have been caused by a fire within the electrical wiring above the cockpit. The fire damaged and disabled multiple avionics systems, including the transponders and SATCOM. In the case of Flight 370, the sudden loss of communication and subsequent deviation from its scheduled flight path might have been a direct response to a fire. The two pilots may have turned back towards Malaysia to attempt an emergency landing at the nearest suitable airport. But no such attempt was ever made. Instead, Flight 370 kept going and remained aloft for another 6 hours. Some have theorized the crew might have been incapacitated by a sudden or gradual loss of cabin pressure. For instance, when Helios Airways Flight 522 failed to pressurize in August of 2005, the pilots quickly fell unconscious. Yet the aircraft continued to fly on autopilot for more than 2 hours until it ran out of fuel. Airline pilots are of course trained for such an event. In the event of cabin depressurization, an automatic system is designed to deploy oxygen masks to give the pilots enough time to perform an emergency descent to a more breathable altitude. The data recorded by the Malaysian military radar does indeed contain altitude information, but it is highly inconsistent. In fact, the Boeing 777 is incapable of performing the extreme altitude fluctuations recorded. At one point, the aircraft exceeded its maximum operating altitude by more than 15,000 feet before making a 50,000 feet nosedive in less than a minute. Attempts to recreate these maneuvers on a flight simulator were unsuccessful, and thus the data was deemed inaccurate and unreliable. If Flight 370 did lose cabin pressure at 35,000 feet and the pilots were incapacitated before descending to a more oxygenated altitude, it might explain why the aircraft remained aloft for as long as it did. What is a bit more difficult to explain, however, are these alterations in heading. Flight simulations have established the aircraft must have been under manual control during the initial left turn, as the bank angle or inclination of that turn was beyond the limits of the autopilot. Subsequent turns, however, could have been either manual or automatic. But for the autopilot to have made these course corrections, someone with the requisite knowledge must have programmed it to do so. The only other alternative is that the aircraft was in fact under manual control. In late June of 2014, several news outlets reported that a special investigation had identified the captain of Flight 370 as a prime suspect. A search of the captain's home had uncovered a flight simulator which supposedly contained a suspicious route which ended in the southern Indian Ocean. At the time, there was no official acknowledgement that such a route had been recovered, and a lengthy public report issued by the Malaysian government in 2015 made no mention of such a discovery. Then, in 2016, confidential documents pertaining to a forensic examination conducted by the Royal Malaysia Police in May of 2014 was leaked to the media. These documents made it clear that such a route had not only been recovered, but thoroughly examined. Soon thereafter, the Malaysian government confirmed the existence of this simulated flight path, and this is what it looks like. It should come as no surprise that many regard this as damning evidence of premeditation, but according to investigators, it is not quite so evident. The data recovered consists of 7 coordinates, 2 in Kuala Lumpur, 2 in the Strait of Malacca, 1 in the Bay of Bengal, and 2 in the southern Indian Ocean. The data was reconstructed from a file that had been automatically generated and saved by the simulation software a month before the incident. However, it's not clear whether the coordinates originate from the same flight session. In other words, it might not be correct to simply trace a continuous line between these 7 coordinates, as they could be from separate sessions. The forensic examination by the Royal Malaysia Police simply concluded no activity captured conclusively indicate any kind of premeditated act pertaining to the incident of MH370. Even so, the similarities between the simulated route and the presumed route of Flight 370 directly influenced the search operation. Australian investigators considered the possibility of someone deliberately extending the range of the flight by gliding the aircraft off the fuel exhaustion. If so, the plane could have traveled an additional 200 kilometers. Alternatively, the range could have been reduced by a controlled ditching prior to fuel exhaustion. While ultimately deemed unlikely, these two scenarios did affect the search effort. If the captain steered Flight 370 off course with the intention of crashing in a remote part of the southern Indian Ocean, his motive is an even greater mystery. Zahari Ahmad Shah was 53 and married with 3 children. He had more than 18,000 hours of flight experience and a spotless track record. Investigators found no evidence of financial issues, and his monthly expenses before the disappearance indicated nothing unusual. He had no history of mental illness, nor had he displayed any recent changes in lifestyle or behavior. He was raised on the island of Penang, which has led some to speculate the flight's second turn to the southwest of Penang was the captain getting a final view of his hometown. Some believe a hijacking could have been politically motivated, as Zahari was an avid supporter of a democratic opposition leader who was sentenced to 5 years in prison mere hours before Flight 370 took off. Others point to unconfirmed reports of marital issues, but this is contradicted by the official investigation and disputed by family members. The only real inconsistency noted by the final report is that the captain failed to repeat the assigned radio frequency during the last verbal communication.
Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9. Good night.
Good night, Malaysian 370.
It would have been standard procedure to repeat the assigned frequency, as the captain had correctly done a few minutes prior.
370, contact Lampu Radar 1326, good night.
Alright, 1326 Malaysian 370.
Whether this omission is indicative of anything but a mistake is anyone's best guess. By all accounts, Captain Zahari was an affable and well-respected pilot who was passionate about aviation, as evident by the photos and videos he shared on social media.
Hi everyone, this is a YouTube video that I made as a community service after learning.
The co-pilot was found to be even less conspicuous. Farik Abdul Hamid was only 27 and due to marry a fellow pilot. He had nearly 3,000 hours of flight experience, although only 39 hours in this type of aircraft. Much like Zahari, Farik had no financial, mental or interpersonal issues of note, nor was there any evidence of conflict between the two of them. Some questioned the plausibility of a pilot-instigated hijacking due to the apparent lack of interference by the other pilot. Well, when Ethiopian Airlines Flight 702 was hijacked by the co-pilot in February of 2014, he did so by merely waiting for the captain to take a bathroom break before locking the cockpit door behind him. The co-pilot was then free to divert the Italy-bound flight to Switzerland to seek asylum. The only noteworthy piece of evidence in regards to the co-pilot of Flight 370 is his phone. You see, when the confidential documents were leaked, they also confirmed another long-circulated rumor, namely that a cell phone tower had briefly established a connection with an iPhone 5S belonging to the co-pilot as Flight 370 approached the island of Penang. According to investigators, it was not a phone call as has been widely reported by the media, but merely an automatic location signal. Why this information was omitted from public reports, we may never know. So what is one to make of all of this? On the one hand, the simulated flight path seems suspicious. On the other, it is difficult to cast any substantial doubt on either of the two pilots' character. It is equally difficult to deny a hijacking is consistent with the available evidence. Then again, we're missing some quite major and literal pieces of evidence. The final report issued by the Malaysian government in 2018 could not attribute the loss of communication nor diversion of Flight 370 to a malfunction. Instead, it is believed that someone manually manipulated the aircraft and its systems. For instance, investigators believe SATCOM was manually disabled by a sudden and prolonged interruption of power. Then, once power was restored, the terminal simply rebooted. Likewise, the alterations in heading are believed to be the result of manual inputs. With that being said, the uncertainty of these findings are repeatedly emphasized due to the limited evidence available, and the report does never explicitly state the flight was hijacked. In fact, no real conclusion is reached. Both the Malaysian and Australian government agree that Flight 370 crashed in the southern Indian Ocean, but that the cause is indeterminable without the wreckage, the location of which has managed to elude some of the foremost aviation experts in the world, as well as an impressive arsenal of cutting-edge technology for more than half a decade. Authors, aviation experts, and independent investigators have all chimed in to offer their own thoughts and theories as to the nature of the crash and the location of the wreckage. Some believe there was no crash, but that the aircraft was shot down by an American naval base in the middle of the Indian Ocean. The satellite transmissions were then supposedly forged as part of a massive cover-up. Others believe the aircraft turned right towards India and traveled as far north as Kazakhstan, completely undetected. Debris was then supposedly planted along shorelines of southeastern Africa as part of a massive cover-up. Another theory suggests the aircraft was remotely hijacked and controlled by someone on the ground. While Boeing and other companies have experimented with technology that would allow for an aircraft to be remotely controlled, no commercial airliner is known to be outfitted with such a system. On the less conspiratorial side, the assumption that Flight 370 flew in a straight line and at a constant speed after turning left towards the southern Indian Ocean might simply be incorrect. In early 2018, a French team of independent investigators proposed an alternate flight path, whereby an attempted landing on Christmas Island led to a crash site much further north than the region identified by the official investigation. While a surface search of this area was conducted about a week after the disappearance, the underwater phase never reached this far north. As of the making of this video, the search operation has been suspended, but there have been talks of potentially resuming the search. For now, it seems, the vanishing of Flight 370 will remain a mystery.
Just let me know.
In 1950, an article was published in multiple American newspapers highlighting numerous unexplained disappearances between the coast of Florida and the island of Bermuda. The article details 5 separate incidents over the previous half-decade in which 1 boat, 9 planes, and some 135 civilians and crewmen vanished without a trace. It was the first time this particular region of the ocean was suspected of being abnormally prone to nautical vanishments. But as the author failed to provide a cause for this alleged abnormality, a provocative mystery was born. In 1952, a magazine specializing in the paranormal outlined the region of interest as a triangle between the US state of Florida as well as the 2 islands of Puerto Rico and Bermuda. If this triangular shape seems almost arbitrarily selected, it's because it was. The author makes no attempt to justify their selection of this shape. Once this idea of an enigmatic triangle had been thrust upon the world, its eventual name was inevitable. A 1964 issue of the American pulp fiction magazine Argosy featured a cover with the caption, "Lost in the Bermuda Triangle." The article inside covers many of the same vanishments as the previous 2, but with a severely embellished narrative, complete with fictitious quotes and alarming suppositions. Which is exactly what you'd expect from a magazine predominantly about fiction. Few would suppose a magazine with a sensational cover like this to supply them with a scientifically sound and comprehensively researched analysis. And why would you? Argosy was targeting a very specific crowd. Those who seek to be entertained by mysteries, not those who seek to understand them. The Bermuda Triangle is, and has always been, a mystery for mystery's sake. The very definition of a legend. One of the oldest stories said to exemplify the mysterious qualities of the Bermuda Triangle is that of the first transatlantic voyage by Christopher Columbus in 1492. 3 events are said to be of note. The crew observed a fireball of some kind, their compasses inexplicably malfunctioned, and a strange light seemed to be suspended above the ocean surface. The fireball was more precisely described as a marvelous branch of fire that fell from the sky into the sea. While invoking aliens and UFOs would certainly be more exciting, there's really no need, as a meteor would be more than qualified to account for that description. In fact, shooting stars are the most common in September due to the orbit and tilt of the Earth, and this sighting occurred on September the 15th. On September the 17th, the crew noticed their compasses misaligned with the North Star. This was certainly alarming at the time, but we've since learned that this is due to an effect known as magnetic declination. In short, the needle in a compass aligns with magnetic north, while the North Star aligns with true north. More importantly, however, neither of these two events occurred anywhere near the Bermuda Triangle, but in the middle of the North Atlantic, a fact that many seem to conveniently disregard. However, the strange light was indeed sighted within the confines of the triangle. Columbus described the light as a small wax candle that rose and lifted up, but he also believed it to be an indication of land and never described it as inexplicable. In fact, mere hours after observing the light, a crewman first caught sight of the American continent, supporting Columbus's suspicion that the light emanated from a nearby landmass, perhaps a torch or bonfire by the indigenous population. As should be evident by now, this is all very mysterious, as long as you refrain from looking beneath the surface.
447-149, Jack!
Tell me something. What the hell is happening here?
It's flight number 19!
19 what?
It's that training mission from the Naval Air Station at Fort Lauderdale!
Who flies crates like these anymore?
No one! These planes were reported missing in 1945.
Flight 19, featured here in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, is possibly the most famous disappearance connected to the Bermuda Triangle. Some would argue it is the catalyst for the entire phenomenon. The story goes like this. On the 5th of December 1945, a squadron of 5 planes departed a naval air station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It was a routine navigation exercise that should not have posed a problem for these 14 experienced pilots and crewmen. Some 2 hours into the exercise, the squadron was supposed to be heading back when the pilot of the leading plane reported that he'd become disoriented as both his compasses were malfunctioning. Multiple stations maintained sporadic contact with Flight 19, attempting to determine their current location with little to no success. Communications between the 5 planes were also intercepted, and they could be heard arguing over directions and bearings. As the minutes passed, the signal between the towers and Flight 19 gradually weakened, and it became increasingly difficult to maintain a stable line of communication. Roughly 4 hours after takeoff, Navy personnel was able to approximate the flight's current location at some 200 kilometers north of their intended flight path. A flying boat with designation ST-49 was consequently dispatched to this location, but after a routine transmission, it inexplicably disappeared. 5 hours after takeoff, a final transmission was intercepted. It was simply a failed attempt by one plane to contact another, and Flight 19 was never seen or heard from again. It sure sounds mysterious, but I suspect the devil is not in the ocean, but in the details. The 5 planes were piloted by 4 students and 1 flight instructor named Charles Taylor. Upon departure, one of the students assumed the role of flight leader, while Taylor merely acted as a supervisor. After turning north towards the island of Grand Bahama, Taylor believed the student to be guiding them in the wrong direction, so he assumed command of the flight. As you read the radio logs and testimonies by Navy personnel, it becomes evident that Taylor confused the islands in the Bahamas for the islands in the Florida Keys. He was heard saying, "Both my compasses are out and I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I am over land, but it's broken. I'm sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down and I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale." In other words, he confused his actual position for this position. This may be hard to accept, as Taylor was an experienced pilot, but then consider this. Taylor had previously been stationed as a flight instructor at the Naval Air Station in Miami, and training exercises launched from Miami took place over the Florida Keys. Prior to that, he'd been stationed at Key West in the Florida Keys. So it's entirely possible that Flight 19 was Taylor's first time flying this route over the Bahamas. Something that further supports this theory is that Taylor initially identified himself as MT-28, standing for Miami Torpedo Bomber 28. His correct ID was FT-28 for Fort Lauderdale. This growing confusion of what he knew from experience and what he saw outside his windows is likely why he came to distrust his instruments, as it's highly unlikely that both his compasses malfunctioned simultaneously. As Taylor thought he was in the Keys, he continued flying north in an attempt to reach land, but this had the opposite effect of taking them further out to sea. He was also disincentivized from turning west, as from Taylor's perspective, that would have taken them into the Gulf of Mexico. In reality, turning west would have saved their lives. Meanwhile, the weather was getting worse, the sun was setting, visibility was poor, and the sea grew increasingly violent. The logs reveal how truly desperate the situation became.